personal?
It was always very personal. It got more political over the years. You know, what language we have, and when we have new language, what that does to our own experiences of ourselves. And that's one of the most exciting things about writing poems about gender, because it's not like I go into the poem feeling like I've figured myself out. I go into the poem as a place to explore and learn through the writing process. And so it got into my brain that art was activism and that you intermesh those things. And that's when I started, writing.
In that tradition, I will say, while Bob gave you a list of plenty of beat and post-beat names that you should check out, I will not be mentioning a single beat poet in this presentation. Though I am thinking about this question of, I guess, the post-beat legacy and what that looks like in the context of performance poetry and contemporary American protest. So I'm going to jump right in with poetry. And this is a piece of a poem by a genderqueer poet, Andrea Gibson. So just so you know, Andrea Gibson uses they, them pronouns. So throughout the paper, when I'm talking about Andrea, those are the pronouns I will be using. So, the doctor said an antipsychotic might help me forget what the trauma said. The trauma said, don't write this poem. Nobody wants to hear you cry about the grief inside your bones, but my bones said, Tyler Clementi dove into the Hudson River convinced he was entirely alone. My bones said, write the poem. And this poem is alternatively titled The Madness Vase, or The Nutritionist, queer activist, poet Andrea Gibson ruminates on the responsibility of the poet to speak, and where this responsibility intersects with the artist's own guttural, even selfish need to create. For Gibson, both are an act of salvation. Tyler Clementi was an 18-year-old student at Rutgers University who committed suicide after his roommate used social media to publicly out him as queer. In Tyler's story, Gibson recognizes their own trauma. The call Gibson feels to write the poem is both a personal need to express that trauma and a communal responsibility to speak it as shared experience. We do not have to look further than this room to see poetry's ability to create powerful communal spaces. From Columbia University to Gallery 6 to City Lights to Tangier to Vienna and beyond, beat art has created and fostered literal and figurative places for personal, political, radical, artistic expression. For this presentation, I am interested in exploring that legacy by taking a closer look at performance poetry in our current political moment. I focus on nationally known poets like Andrea Gibson and Moore Mother, who we will be fortunate enough to hear from just after lunch, as well as local Pittsburgh artists like the collective One Hood Media Group, who utilize their poetry to speak their own marginalized experiences as Black, queer, female, non-binary, neurologically atypical, or mentally ill in the United States of America. So this is totally a screenshot from my phone of an Instagram post that was on by Andrea Gibson yesterday, so I kind of had to share this. But so through platforms like YouTube, Instagram, or Facebook, and nationwide tours, these poets have the capacity to reach an audience of millions that transcends borders. And Gibson, as of yesterday, posted this a few hours in at 1,200 likes. Now it's upwards of thousands. Has 44,000 followers on Instagram alone. And this is a post from a show where they were performing this week, and it's a sold-out concert venue, and the picture's not very clear, but you can read the kind of caption they wrote. And I like the bit at the end where they say, I was asked in an interview if I thought poetry was going out of style. LOL, no. And what I would argue is in the beat ethos, these poets are able to use these platforms to speak the experiences of the most vulnerable, through its ability to elevate the voices and experiences of marginalized communities, and I will argue build alternative and imagined futures amidst a political environment that would like to silence and invalidate those experiences. Performance poetry is one of the most powerful tools of protest that we have available to us. For Andrea Gibson, the personal has always been political. In 2010, they made national headlines when a member of the Utah legislature read their poem, Say Yes, at a meeting of the House of Representatives. The headline for a Huffington Post article read, Gay Poem Shakes Up Utah Legislature. With absolutely no mention of or allusion to queer sexuality, the only gay thing about the poem is the poet. Gibson likes to joke that Say Yes, an anthem to embracing possibility, is likely the least gay poem they've ever written. In a 2018 interview, Gibson explains their writing is inherently political because of their willingness to celebrate their identity as marginalized other. Gibson identifies most as a love poet. They're a genderqueer, non-binary poet who, in writing love poems to their partners, is inherently committing a political act in the United States of America, where actually in my home state of Pennsylvania, there are no protections against gender identity. You can still be removed from your apartment or your job for being trans, for being non-binary. These are real contemporary laws. So it is political just to exist and then to speak that existence as a poet. After the election of Donald Trump, Gibson was driven to create art that worked harder to engage with social justice. In the same interview, Gibson says, quote, "I think my writing at this point comes with fewer answers and more questions, and trying to leave people investigating their own lives and the world around them. I don't feel like I have any answers. The world is in such a wild place right now, and I feel like we are living in such a critical, crucial time." For me, this invokes the framework that Thomas Rabb was discussing yesterday in our keynote, which I think is an awesome framework for a lot of what I'm talking about today. The question, is contemplatively working on my/your mindset already political, even though it may have yet to change one single concrete action? Like Thomas, my answer is yes, kind of has to be yes, because I believe in this stuff. And this is the work that I see Andrea Gibson engaging in. In a more recent poem titled "Letter to White Queers, a Letter to Myself," Gibson writes a letter reflecting on their position in the hierarchy of white supremacy, and asks the audience, in this instance both themselves and the white queer community, to consider the ways that we uphold this hierarchy. So I have a little clip from...
And it's in the spirit of attempting a healthy dialogue with people leaving racist comments on my Facebook page. Also, in the spirit of understanding, it should never be the responsibility of people of color to educate white people about white privilege and white supremacy. And also, all going to learn and grow at a pace that will hurt people, but right now I am ready to tell you that I am furious with my own pace. Furious that I could be holding the candlestick of a microphone for this many years and have it burn this far down without shining a hell of a lot more light on the truth of what I know white is. You want to know what white is? White is having somebody tell you be a pleasure to hang, having a whole lot of people agree and not even thinking to lock your fucking door that night. White is knowing if somebody is going to be hung, you are not the one. White is having all of Eric Gardner's air in your lungs, no matter how queer you are, no matter how anything you are. If you are white, you have Eric Gardner's air in your lungs tonight, and that means your breath is not yours to hold. That means our exhale is owed to mercy, to the riot of our unowned hearts, to the promise that who we weep and fight and tear down the fucking sun for will not only be our own faces in the mirror, to the knowing that we cannot be married to apathy without wearing the rings of the fucking poplar tree when our country is still lynching and still calling the hung body shade, when our country is right now rolling a red carpet from the blood that pours, and people are dying for us to notice our footsteps are red. Our silence is not a plastic gun. It is fully loaded. It has lethal aim. It is 1990.
So that's just a sample of Gibson as a performance poet, and they're amazing. So wander down that YouTube rabbit hole, it's wonderful. But this poem specifically is great. It's a newer piece, a letter to white queers, a letter to myself. For Gibson, it is the responsibility of the poet to help dismantle these systems of oppression through the tools that they have available. Speech. Gibson is, quote, furious that they could be holding the candlestick of a microphone for this many years and have it burn this far down without shining a hell of a lot more light. Writing and performing poetry since 1999, Gibson recognizes that they have a platform and a position of safety and privilege from which to speak out on the crisis of state-sanctioned violence against black and brown bodies and the systemic racism inherent in the United States' failing systems of justice. They acknowledge their own failure to use these tools sooner. Earlier in the poem, they say, you know, I've been writing 16 years, and the word gentrification has never made it into a single one of my poems. And they ask themselves, and they ask their audience to do better, reminding us that lives depend upon it. Our silence is, quote, not a plastic gun, it is fully loaded, and it has lethal aim. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Sandra Bland, Corinne Gaines, Tamir Rice, Philando Castile, Botham Jean, these are only a few of the victims of that violence. And on June 19, 2018, police in East Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is where I am from and where I live, murdered 17-year-old Antoine Rose Jr. The murder of a 17-year-old boy by police just minutes from your home is heartbreaking, it is devastating, and in the United States of America in 2018, it is sickeningly familiar. In the hours, days, and weeks after Antoine was murdered, protests erupted throughout the city of Pittsburgh. Hundreds gathered in neighborhoods throughout the city, night after night, shutting down traffic and businesses, disrupting daily order to draw attention to our community's suffering. A demonstration of our collective frustration and pain, these protests sought accountability from local government and justice for Antoine's family. While this question of justice remains unanswered, and we could spend an entire conference just beginning to discuss the ongoing work of groups like Black Lives Matter and the desperately needed reform on racial justice in the United States, I will note that the officer who murdered Antoine Rose was arrested on charges of criminal homicide on June 26, nearly after a week of protests, though he has since been released on bail. These protests were powerful to witness, but Philadelphia-based poet and musician Kamehameha, through her project More Mother, reminds us that we have seen them before, and the same systems are not enough to enact political change. Her piece, Deadbeat Protest, off of the album Fetish Bones, warns against the fetishization of black bodies, the cultural fascination with Black Death, and the constant devaluing of black lives. So I'm going to play you a little bit of that, though you will be lucky enough. You don't even get to hear the words there, and I'm not going to adjust that, but I'll read them for you. The track is jarring and dissonant as the poet growls, quote, trying to save my black life by fetishizing my dead life. Fuck, get away from me. You can see my dead body at the protest. You can see my dead body at the protest. Deadbeat Protest forces listeners to consider their role in the movement for racial justice and to question how much the work of activists and artists is reactionary. Her work, maybe more than any I have yet encountered, asks us to partake in the internal revolution by shifting our way of thinking. Her track creates discomfort, both sonically and morally, as it demands that we do more than just show up to, at best, mourn black bodies, and at worst, gawk at black suffering. What was unique about the Pittsburgh protests is the role of poetry. A poem written by Antoine Rose Jr. 2 years before he was killed was found by his 10th grade English teacher, Laura Athrell, and given to his family. His poem, titled I Am Not What You Think, expressed the terror of growing up black in the U.S. And I'll drop it back into this. I'll leave it there so you can read it. But this was the poem that Antoine wrote for class. He'd written it for an assignment in which students were asked to comment on their place in the world around them. The line, I am confused and afraid, repeats 4 times in Rose's poem. He worries about death, he worries about his mother, he worries about the way people see him. While it is simply the poem of a 10th grade student, it is confessional, it is personal, and it invites us to view the world as a 17-year-old black boy in the United States of America. In the book Emergent Strategy, a kind of guide for social change, one of many such texts to emerge after the Trump inauguration, author Adrienne Marie Brown argues that we are, quote, in an imagination battle, and the only way to win is to ideate, imagine, and conceive together. She argues, quote, Trayvon Martin and Mike Brown, Rashina McBride, and so many others are dead because in some white imagination they were dangerous, and the imagination is so respected that those who kill based on imagined racialized fear of black people are rarely held accountable. Our revolutionary task now is to imagine new worlds that transition these ideologies and norms. In what she calls, quote, a time travel exercise for the heart, she asks us to imagine the ideas that will liberate us. In other words, how do I work to change my/your mindset? Brown's strategy invites everyone to take place in this imagining, but the artist, and more specifically the performance poet, is particularly positioned to do this work. Rose's mother asked that this poem be shared. She told Athrell that she felt her son speaking to them through his poem, not only for himself, but for the kids growing up around him. His family chose to print the poem on the funeral program and to have it read at his service. One Hood Media, a Pittsburgh-based collective of socially conscious poets and activists who seek to organize our communities for real change, took to their social media to share the poem. And as protesters gathered night after night throughout the city of Pittsburgh, the poem was read. Like a ritual, on the steps of the city courthouse, in the streets of East Pittsburgh, poets, friends, neighbors, activists, strangers gathered to give voice to Antoine's words. In the reading, the sharing, and the performing of Antoine's poem, there was an outpouring of a community's grief and an attempt to create space for collective healing. Like Gibson, More Mother believes that poetry and the artist have the ability to create these kinds of spaces. In a 2017 Passage interview, she says, quote, "I feel like it is important for artists to not only speak about the things happening in the community, but also to be a part of the envisioning of the future of that community. For More Mother, envisioning a radically different future is inextricably linked to understanding communal history. Her poetry uses sound to invite cycles as she reaches backwards and forwards in time. She does this in a piece called The Creation Myth. I've been bleeding since 1866, dragged my bloody self to 1919. The same place I was in 1866, a bleeding black body blowing in the wind, tripping, an ironic thickness of things never changing. Time is a balancing act encompassing all things, suspended in illusion. This piece collapses a linear notion of time as it pulls us into the cyclical trauma of Black history. The black body has always been bleeding, but there is power in the poet's ability to speak this. Awea and her creative partner, Rashida Phillips, created a literary collective entitled Black Quantum Futurism, which builds on existing ideas of Afrofuturism to imagine alternative realities. And Afrofuturism, in case you need a definition, is a cultural aesthetic philosophy of science and philosophy of history that explores the developing intersection of African diaspora culture with technology. One of the radical reimaginings of Black quantum futurism is the rejection of a linear notion of time. In the dominant cultural timeline, history is written by the oppressors, and there is no visible future. BQF seeks to liberate us from these timelines by reimagining time as change, as patterns, as cyclical. In inviting individuals and communities to resituate themselves in time, BQF invites them to rethink their position in the universe. In an oversimplification of this thought, nothing is fixed and anything is possible. For Andrea Gibson, More Mother, and One Hood, collective echoing Antoine Rose's poems in the streets, poetic sound acts as an agent of resistance. Whether through the utterance of language or the manipulation of instruments, it has the power to disrupt our thought, to push us to seek new meaning in familiar signifiers, and to connect us to communities across space and time. On July 12, 2018, Antoine Rose Jr. would have turned 18. Friends, family, local churches, community organizers, and the One Hood Collective chose to celebrate Antoine's life at the first annual Antoine Rose Community Day. In a block party style event, the community came together in celebration. There was a bounce house and face painting, a pamper station, and there were poets. Spoken word poets and performers from all over the city of Pittsburgh were invited to speak in the celebration of life and Black joy. Beyond protest, the event was a moment of victory in this imaginative battle, inviting us to see an imagined future where this kind of collective healing no longer needs to be a radical act.
And so it got into my brain that art was activism and that you intermesh those things. And that's when I started, writing.